Now, as we already were mentioning, actually, a lot of speakers were mentioning in the past sessions, regulation, one of the biggest hurdles that we should still take. Regulation on a national level, regional level, European level, global level. And usually, when we look at new technologies, there is this pacing problem, right? There's always the new technologies which are developing really fast. And on the other side, there is the government trying to catch up with their regulation. But there's always a very, very big gap in between. And what we already heard from most of the speakers, is they really go to the governments and demand some regulation. They need a regulatory framework. Our next speaker is assistant professor and also member of the expert panel at the European Union Blockchain Observatory Forum. So really looking forward to this conversation with Agata Ferreira. Agata, welcome. You're mute.
Hello, welcome. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now. So thank you so much for joining. Where are you joining us from?
I'm joining you from Portugal, and I feel very, very humbled, very inspired and humbled by my by Anne who spoke before me. So incredible story and very, very inspiring ideas and passion. And here I am, boring about law and spoiling the fun.
I'm not going to say that. I mean, the reason why we invited you is because we think you're doing also some incredible work in the scene. Let us just start. Where did your blockchain journey started?
Well, I acquired my legal education in several jurisdictions, so I'm always, I was always try to challenge myself on the legal point of view. And at some point in that journey, I worked several years in the financial sector in London, and I saw rise and fall of financial sector and the flaws of it as well. And the hype and everything. And then at some point in that journey, my further journey, I got exposed to technology, and I realized just how big of a gap there is between law and technology, and between legal community and the language they speak and terminology they use, and technological community and the language they speak, and how fast they develop, and how much behind law is. So from there was just very quick shortcut to blockchain, because this is probably one of the most challenging innovation for regulators and lawmakers, that really kind of disrupts a lot of conceptual frames of regulation. So I got very passionate about that, and and here I am in this space for some time.
Now, speaking of a big gap, if we're looking to on the European perspective, how big is the gap currently between like the industry and the regulators?
Well, we are in the process of trying to close that gap, actually, with all the regulatory proposals that are on the agenda. But mostly, apart from financials, let's say financial sphere, everything else is kind of in this gray area. Obviously, that depends also on the individual countries, because there are some proactive countries in Europe that have already designed their own regulatory framework for this space, and that have been proactively providing guidance to the industry and trying to figure out how to regulate and how to respond to this regulation. But this has kind of two sides. First of all, there are discrepancies between the jurisdictions in Europe. Second, there is a lot of uncertainty in those jurisdictions that haven't responded yet. And also there is a great opportunity and risk of regulatory arbitrage, so fragmented legal framework across Europe. That's why European Commission took initiative last year and designed a proposal for a regulatory framework for markets in crypto assets, famous MiCA, which has been discussed ever since, and we're still not done, but hopefully early next year, we can see the end of that journey and the regulation being actually passed.
Okay, so next year, that's interesting to hear. We had a meetup actually about MiCA with some lawyers from the Netherlands who are working with cryptocurrency companies on the implementation of MiCA. Interesting to hear from your side that probably next year this regulation will be put into place. Is that correct? On the European level?
Yes, it is our hope. However, you have to remember that between that regulation being passed and being actually applicable, there is still a grandfathering period there. So we're looking at a foreseeable future, but this timeline, it's dynamic, and we actually going to have to wait and see how this develops. But definitely, the idea is to have MiCA in place as soon as possible to provide industry with some certainty. And Europe is also aiming to be this to provide a benchmark for other jurisdictions, and it will be certainly first jurisdictional region of this size that comes with this bespoke, very specific and detailed regulation for crypto asset space.
Yes, are we like really, if we look to if it will be implemented hopefully next year, we will be the first compared to the US, for example?
Well, certainly the first on this scale.
Okay.
There are other jurisdictions that have already responded to this innovation, but on this scale and in this great amount of detail, I believe we will be pioneers. And it remains to be seen if we are going to be the jurisdiction everyone is following, or perhaps distancing themselves from.
No.
So it's a huge task and a huge risk for Europe. To what are we going to become the leaders in this space, or will others observe and just cherry pick the best bits of it and implement better regulatory frameworks?
Now I'm wondering, we spoke about MiCA, but you also mentioned, of course, the other regulation package. I think it's more focused on the DLT. Is that right? So more on the GDPR aspects, or where should we think of?
Well, there is a DLT pilot regime which was part of the same digital finance package that was announced last year in September. But the DLT framework is more limited to financial kind of area and perhaps less impactful than MiCA will be.
Okay. Now, let's dig a little bit deeper in regulation, especially good regulation. According to you, what does good regulation? What does good regulation encompass?
Okay, well, that's a
Question from the audience.
Very good question. I think, first of all, I would like to emphasize broader issues. Okay, this technology really disrupts certain conceptual frames of regulation. Its basic normative idea, hierarchy of goals, I would say, and some tools and mechanisms that were put in place in this long time evolution of regulatory and legal framework. And the rapid development of this technology keeps regulators in forever in this reactive kind of posture rather than proactive. So it's a catch-up strategy, and that is never a good strategy. As the time goes by, the regulators learn and they acquire experience, etc. So this is improving, but it's an evolution, it's a learning curve. So this regulation is really challenging, and it's challenging regulators not as a matter of degree, but as a matter of principle. And I think Anne before me has mentioned that this innovation is changing, like bringing completely new ideas and new infrastructure and new basis for everything rather than improving what we already have. And this is the challenge for the regulators. So this is a very tough test of competency for regulators, but at the same time, it creates a very unique opportunity, and it's not always realized, I observe, because of this reactionary stance of regulators until now. So we have this great opportunity to reassess some of the institutional design, some of the regulatory matrix that we are using. And unfortunately, many regulators are still limited and closed in the individual silos with limited mandates, with jurisdictional boundaries. So there is still limited amount of this cross-jurisdictional collaboration, and that will be needed for good regulation, for good supportive regulatory framework. And also along the line of this blockchain development, there were some occurrences that put regulators on alert and on a defensive kind of pose, which is, for example, announcement of Libra project. So that announcement basically rang alarm bells across the globe among authorities and regulators, and that perhaps contaminated a little bit the general approach to this innovation. And there are some other phenomena like stable coins, which also kind of are causing regulators to be more worried than open to opportunities. So the dominant regulatory stance is focused on this specific, punctuated perhaps some market failures, some direct threats, some extraordinary occurrences, and there needs to be a broader approach to regulation and a broader view, and seizing that unique opportunity to reassess our regulatory frameworks. But it's certainly challenging. But there are deep questions that we can answer here. We have opportunity to answer. We can ask ourselves what deficiencies of the existing systems and existing infrastructures does this innovation expose, and how we can address that, and how these new groups of assets really fit in or perhaps defy existing regulatory terminology, classifications, and frameworks. We should really understand how these decentralized spaces function, because they cannot really be really be fitting into the existing regulatory boxes and categories. So as Anne was saying, there's a boom of DAOs around the world, and these are very specific organizations, let's say, but they completely defy existing regulatory frameworks, and very few jurisdictions have recognized that. Very, very few.
Is it possible to regulate decentralized applications, organizations, decentralized finance? Is it possible to regulate them?
I think we should ask ourselves how regulators could support this innovation to harvest the benefits of it. Because is it possible to regulate almost sounds, how can we control it? How can we capture it within the existing frameworks? And I think the outlook should be how could we provide mechanisms, and how can we provide new mechanisms and tools, legal and regulatory, to support these organizations, because they need support.
They need support. And interesting what you mentioned, because the developments, of course, go so fast, right? We see NFTs, metaverse, play-to-earn games. But as you're already mentioning, I mean, mostly the regulators are always catching up with when it comes to regulation, right? So when the GDPR was implemented, it was already outdated when you looked at blockchain, how the data was stored. How can we make sure that all this regulation that is will be launched hopefully next year, maybe the year after, has not a negative impact on innovation?
Well, that's a very good question. How can we ensure? I think there is nothing better than collaboration with the industry, than the strategy of being open, understanding the potential of this innovation, and trying to bring it on shore, trying to harvest this capital and this innovation within jurisdictional boundaries. Because you have to always remember, this is a digital innovation that's very portable. So the innovation will be drawn to places which are friendlier and more supportive. So if you over-regulate, you can effectively regulate the innovation out of your jurisdiction to the disadvantage of that particular jurisdiction, but also consumers in that jurisdiction, which will be denied access to certain products and services that are very much needed in some areas specifically. So, openness and collaboration with the industry, and more profound understanding of how these new technologies challenge core principles and the logics of the existing regulatory frameworks. And really awareness of how quickly that innovation progresses, This is not evolution, this is revolution. And in law, we know evolution. Law develops incrementally, step by step. We develop doctrines, we develop interpretations, and there is almost no time for that.
Yeah.
So it's a very interesting challenge.
Yeah, because usually with blockchain technology, they mention like, it's happening readily, then suddenly, and then it goes so fast that it's really tough for regulators to catch up. We looked at the downsides, the negative effect of regulation, potential negative effect on innovation. If we turn it into a positive way, how can regulation actually support the broader blockchain and cryptocurrency ecosystem?
I think there's two sides to regulation, to the idea of regulation, because there is many of these enterprises, many of these projects, they want to be compliant, they want to be transparent, they want to be legitimate in that sense, and it helps to have regulation because until now a lot of these projects operated in gray area with a lot of uncertainty, which kind of stifles innovation because it also prevents you from spending a lot of resources on something you're not sure you will be allowed to do in the future, for example. So the regulatory certainty is welcome, definitely. And regulatory certainty is something that provides a clear understanding of where things are. So that's the first step. I think the other thing that we have to remember that the temptation of providing very prescriptive and detailed regulation might not necessarily be the best way, because this innovation is still kind of in this process of rapid development. It's very hard to predict how it's going to look like in a year, 2 years' time. And legislative process takes time. So if we take initiative today to, let's say, regulate DeFi, in a couple of years' time, by the time this regulation comes into place, it's going to be in a completely different place, that space. So I'd rather focus on principles and more broader regulatory strategies than very prescriptive, detailed, and perhaps costly regulation.
Now, next year, year after, we will see some extensive regulatory frameworks when it comes to MiCA, when it comes to DLT on a European base. When we look more on the country side, this individual countries, the Netherlands, Belgium, Germany, do you see some great examples of governments that are already far ahead of the other European countries when it comes to regulation?
Well, in Europe, certainly there are a couple of countries or so which have been proactive well before EU Commission stepped in. So, for example, Liechtenstein has developed its bespoke regulatory framework that really goes beyond what many regulators have provided so far. So, provides not only regulatory framework for in a general sense, but the bridge with the existing kind of civil law structures, because the blockchain innovation impacts every area of law pretty much. And the digital tokens are not very well embedded in existing regulatory frameworks and legal systems because the bare instrument in the form of a digital token is a new thing. So the legal systems haven't developed tools to embed it yet. So I think the Liechtenstein is one of examples. I think Anne has mentioned Estonia, who has been very proactive in coming up with not only regulatory responses, but also uses of that technology for government, for public administration, etc. There are some countries like Switzerland which have provided guidance very early on, very robust regulations, but they have been proactive in providing guidance. Germany is very active on providing certain regulatory frameworks. So we are seeing more and more of this activity, and we will see a lot more. It's going to be a lot more dense on regulatory on the front.
More dense. When we're looking forward to next year, what are you really excited about? What are you looking forward to personally and maybe also from a regulatory perspective?
Well, I'm very excited about all these developments that I'm observing, and worried about some of them. I see not only regulatory activity but very much regulatory scrutiny. So a lot of the regulatory activity is geared towards scrutinizing and capturing this space more perhaps sometimes than lifting it up and supporting. So I'm hoping to see at some point we will get over the fear. The regulators maybe will get over the fear and start embracing it a little bit more. So maybe next year we'll see. I'm looking forward to see how Europe will position itself on the global kind of scale of regulatory approach to this innovation. Well, that's going to be very interesting to watch.
We're going to keep a close watch on all these developments. It was really nice to discuss this topic thoroughly with you. Thank you so much, Agata Ferreira. It was a pleasure to have this conversation with you. Thank you so much for all your insights and wishing you all the best.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me.